Hello, this podcast is being recorded as part of my graded coursework for Dr. Yana Shirinak's class on Gender and Development at the George August University at Göttingen. My name is Abhilasha Singh and I'm going to be talking with Taranga Sriraman and Vasudha Chandwani. Taranga is an independent feminist social worker with 20 years work experience and a specialization in SGBV response. Her interests and expertise are in gender, sexuality, education, and feminist praxis with the state in particular. She was National Consultant to the Ministry of Human Resources Development, Government of India, now called the Ministry of Education, for the Mahila Samakhya program from 2008 to 2012, during which she was also, in 2012, a member of the Inclusive Education Working Group Task Force of the Ministry's RTE-SSA National Advisory Council. She was at the Resource Center for Interventions on Violence Against Women at TIS Mumbai between 2012 and 21, and led its work on a daily basis across 17 states and 3 union territories as strategic coordinator. At present, she enjoys training and teaching feminist social work praxis with both full-time students and social sector practitioners at a range of organizations, as well as research in and for the third sector. Vasudha is an advocate based out of Mumbai, practicing at the Bombay High Court. Her areas of interest are women's rights, labor laws, and constitutional matters. She is also a fellow with the Center for Law and Policy Research. Our conversation will address gender-based violence in the context of legal legitimation of violence against women's bodies through India's divorce laws and the lack of legitimacy in Indian jurisprudence afforded to cases of marital rape, most recently witnessed in the judgment of the Chhattisgarh High Court. A judgment like this one has not sparked unrest because it is an anomaly of the present, but exists in a historical continuum where heteropatriarchal power relations and capital have reaped benefits from first, the relegation of women to the domestic sphere, and secondly, their subjugation within it. The Indian feminist movement has centered rights-based language in the attempt to secure greater mobility for women, because the concept of agency is problematized by gendered inequality of material conditions, even as caste and class allow for differences among women. Women in India have historically been cast as wives, mothers, and daughters, which has led courts in the past to uphold this characterization, given that they are a product of the social that sprung their existence. This is not how the courts are cast in popular conception, however. According to the preamble of the Indian Constitution, justice precedes liberty, equality, and fraternity, with justice signifying economic, social, and political justice. The role of the court is cast as promoting the rule of law, which famously is taken to mean equal treatment of all subjects of a state before law, and to conduct its work freely and fairly, it is granted independence from control of the legislature as well as the executive. How this formal separation has been compromised in the recent past is not within the purview of this podcast, but what can be said about this framing is that it contributes to the imagination of a just court that lies above the social in its dispensation of justice. This is further driven by the popular symbol of Lady Justice, who in the Enlightenment period had the blind around her eyes reinterpreted to symbolize impartiality of the court. In India, the statue of Lady Justice has been reinterpreted to feature a sari-clad woman wearing a crown, holding the scales of judgment in one hand and the constitution in the other in the name of decolonization. This politics of decolonization plays to the nationalist conception of the woman's body, a symbol from the era of the Indian freedom struggle, and stakes claim to the decolonization of how we met our justice in India without pausing to ask the question of whether decolonization is simply a shorthand for ideas of return to a traditionalism as defined by the Hindu nationalist currents of Indian society. To me, this new image of Lady Justice has two political problems. The first is that this reads as essentialism in the imagination of what it means to be a woman holding the Indian nationality, which is unidimensional and an embodiment of nationalist and socially conservative politics. This reflects remnants of Tagore's novel Ghore Baire that discusses the space of the woman in the Indian freedom struggle and the awkward tug between nationalism and modernity in political participation. In 2025, this statue makes that decision for women by fixing their position as determinedly traditional through being sari-clad, with the crown marking femininity as divine through semiotics that can be inferred from centuries of image-making practices. In that sense, nationalism plays out on the body of women, with the female body, by virtue of now being a goddess, becoming the custodian of characteristics like chastity, virtue, and honor, all characteristics traditionally associated with the private sphere, which is dangerous when weaponized, as in the case of marital rape, sealing it shut from the ambit of fundamental rights defined in Articles 14 and 21. The second problem is that this creates room for argumentation that denies Indian women rights by creating an idea of womanhood that is necessarily in contravention with the idea of Western womanhood, where Indian women are said to not have the same problems as women in the West, leaving much to be desired in the face of justice when it comes to imagining women as people outside of their domestic social roles. As noted by Kalpana Kannabiran in her introduction to the book The Violence of Normal Times, I quote, "The judiciary has, time and again, emphasized the difference between the West and India, especially when it has concerned women, often arguing either explicitly or implicitly that for tradition-bound Indian women, unlike their Western counterparts, equality claims are subservient to the claims of their communities and culture, Indian culture being the pinnacle. The truth is that the idea of mutuality and equality in marriage is neither new nor Western. Draft Article 42 of the Indian Constitution, which was dropped without debate, read, the state shall endeavour to secure that marriage shall be based only on the mutual consent of both sexes and shall be maintained through mutual cooperation with the equal rights of husband and wife as basis. The state shall also recognize that motherhood has a special claim upon its care and protection." End quote. This reinforces my contention that courts and the Constitution are very much a part of the socio-cultural and political economic milieu they inhabit and are not immune to patriarchal reasoning that could in some cases be seen as a denial of justice. This brings us to the concept of women's rights. The idea of human rights flows from a post-colonial context in which the European colonizers, seeing the colonized subject as being lesser human than, had to be negotiated with to bestow upon them the recognition of their humanity. As such, the history of rights is a history of power relations where one group seeks through negotiation, also through a full recognition of their social, political, and economic dominance by another group, a seat at the table as equals before law, because alongside colonialism and this discourse on rights, colonized people inherited the nation-state form from colonial modernity. This makes law highly intertwined with the nation-state form and as a tool of political economy seeks to protect the interests of the state while also positioning itself as the only available recourse for individual protection under the state. This relationship clarifies itself through an affidavit submitted by the Government of India to the Supreme Court on marital rape. It reads, open quotes, "While exercising judicial review on such subjects, it is to be appreciated that the present question is not only a constitutional question, but essentially a social question on which the Parliament, after being apprised and being aware of all sides of the opinion on the present issue, has taken a position." Close quotes. And it points out further that during the 2013 amendments to the IPC, which is the Indian Penal Code, Parliament had carefully considered the issue and opted to retain the marital rape exception, as any move to strike down the exception would have a profound impact on the institution of marriage in India. In another area, you see the court upholding state policy when the question and concern is of equality in employment, where the contestation was in the area of discrimination against air hostesses in favor of air stewards with regard to pregnancy clauses in employment. The court noted that gender formed the basis upon which the two categories of employees formed different classes, and air hostesses would be allowed to keep their jobs even if they were to become pregnant owing to the sacrosanct nature of motherhood, so long as they did not report a third pregnancy in keeping with government initiatives to promote a two-child policy. The other extreme also exists, where women are assumed to be wives and mothers first and employees later, but out of what seems to be spite, they are forced to work on the principles of free competition with men, through which they are expected to juggle paid work to the standard that somebody not socially expected to have familial responsibilities are, or risk losing their jobs. This is also gender-based violence in my opinion, but at this point I would like to segue into the conversation that will focus on the meat of the ideas that I have outlined in this introduction to this podcast today. Hello and welcome, Taranga and Vasudha.
I'm going to ask you a few questions now, so let's get started with that. My first question is to Taranga, and that is, what aspect of political economy thrives on the guarantor of marriage, and what have been the various ways feminists have approached this institution?
Right. So I just wanted to start with wishing you all a happy Women's History Month. So I'm going to take a bit of a historical approach to this very first question. See, almost all aspects of political economy are predicated on marriage itself as an institution, as a guarantor, right? And by all aspects, I mean everything from distribution of wealth and resources to what gets defined as property, as well as who produces, right, through labor and who accrues the profits. So everything, all aspects of political economy are, in my view and the view of almost all feminists, as in feminist streams of thought, do rely on marriage as an institution to guarantee, right, the use and control of women's bodies as property. And the family itself, as in that sense, a unit which not only produces but also reproduces those who do labor. And this is something that, as we all know, that feminism is an umbrella of isms. All feminist understandings, whether liberal or radical or queer feminist, or difference feminist, or disability rights and action feminist, or of course socialist and Marxist feminisms, all of them have approached the institution of marriage as one which relies entirely on and perpetuates in itself the control and use of women and therefore children's bodies also as a productive piece of property. So that is something which is there actually in all feminist approaches. It's just that different kinds of feminist intervention or praxis, discourse-wise as well as like I said, interventions-wise, they approach this institution slightly differently in terms of whether they seek to dismantle it, transform it, reform it, or replace it altogether. So for example, it is liberal feminists who are very clear that the family has a utilitarian value. But for that family to be productive and healthy in the service of the nation, the society, the community, the economy, capitalism itself, whatever, they're very clear that family should be upheld through healthy and equal marriages. Because having rights, especially social, cultural, political rights, and to some extent economic and educational rights, does ensure that healthier children are produced, women are better able to contribute in society and economy. So it is slightly utilitarian in that way. On the other hand, socialist feminists, for example, and Marxist feminists in particular, have done all the work, including of social reproduction theory, which we know as an entire body of discourse and study and theorization or conceptualization. They've been very clear that what helps them to understand both capitalism and patriarchy better is to study in detail how exactly women's productive and reproductive labor through the institution of marriage and therefore a heteronormative couple-based reproductive family, how that in very material terms leads to two different parts of society, as it were, benefiting from the unpaid and undervalued labor provided by women and children. So there are many different, of course, approaches to family as an institution from feminist approaches, but all of them do have this in common, that in some way or the other, they do understand that women's bodies are treated as property and hence controlled.
My other question to you also is, when fighting for women's rights, have Indian feminists chosen legal over political reform? If yes, what ground has the court ceded in women's rights, and which do you think is preferable for long-term equality?
So, since you started with the question about political economy, right? In political economy, law and politics, or in that sense, formal power, are not really separate. And in the feminist understanding, legal reforms, legal rights, harnessing or reclaiming the state and its institutions is not really distinct from political rights. Yeah, it's all lies on in a larger spectrum of actions to be taken. So I would not really, subscribe to. Undoubtedly, in many sections, it's a popular notion that Indian women's movements or Indian feminists have focused more on legal rights and legal reform rather than political rights. I do not subscribe to that or endorse it, because I believe that the securing of legal rights are political in themselves, and this is something that one finds that one often needs to disabuse a lot of even left or progressive feminist allies of that. Where does that slogan, the personal is political, come from, right? Why were women's movements in the 70s and 80s, why were they reminding each other and the world and the United Nations and their governments, lawmakers, etc., and community and society, that the personal is political? It was precisely because there was this false silo being created between private spaces, so-called private spaces, where the law was not allowed to reach, even when there was a violation of women's rights, political, economic, cultural, social, physical, everything. Right. And there was this false dichotomy being created with the family or the workplace or the communities, where the law or the state cannot have a say. Which is precisely why women's movements across the world, feminist movements across the world, did so much work around the slogan, the personal is political, because without legal and the guarantors of international political pressure or bodies or fora on individual governments, there was not going to be any material rights securing for women.
Right. Thank you. That does answer my question. And now I want to slightly move forward to talk about domestic violence. So, in that context, my first question is to Vasudha. Domestic violence as a term comes from non-Indian contexts in which couples of any gender cohabit with each other. But in the case of India, frequently this translates to assault and battery, often for the sake of dowry, and can be carried out by either the partner or the partner's family, as we've seen. Now, the National Family Health Survey conducted by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare between 2015 and 2016 found that 31% of ever married women between the age of 15 to 49 have experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence by their spouse or partner at some point in their lifetime. While the Constitution has provisions that safeguard women against domestic violence, what are some areas this fails to address, and how have violence structures been upheld in judgments?
Yeah, hi. So I'll begin with saying that Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act was given to us through a lot of lobbying and feminist movement. In 1970s, after the Mathura rape case, there was a lot because of the feminist movement, there was a criminal amendment that was brought in, which added cruelty as a criminal offense, and it also added dowry death as in section 304 as a criminal offense. But despite these two being there was a gap, because for every day, it needed an offense to be so violent that only then can they approach the court. So to fill that gap for everyday, the domestic violence that women face, a civil law had to be brought in place. So domestic violence is not a criminal law. It's the prayers in that are civil in nature. Mm-hmm. So with bringing in that act, One, it covered various it defined what different type of violence women face, and secondly, while covering all of that, one thing which is not particularly dealt with, I feel, is the matrimonial property rights. So while it may cover emotional and physical and sexual violence, financial is also considered, where women is not being given maintenance. However, a solution, I mean, even when they are awarded maintenance, it's rarely is it something which they can make do.
Right.
And I mean, one of the provisions under DV Act is the right to residence. Basically, this was brought in so women are not thrown out of their house. The biggest, the most first prayer that we make under this act is to make sure that she has a roof over her head.
Right.
That, she is not left destitute and doesn't have anywhere to go. So that's like she cannot be thrown out of the house, which one would expect, in cases of domestic violence, the first step would be to leave. But that gap still remains, because the question is, when everybody wants to leave, where do they go? There are not, in a lot of cases, firstly, there may just not be enough resources for even the husband to, give another house. So because of that, women, either they are not able to leave, and even if they want to, there is a legal vacuum that they don't really have. I mean, they can't see, they are not entitled to it by law yet. So that is something I feel is a gap with DV Act.
Thank you. Taranga, would you like to comment on this, as your professional experience might have allowed you to interact with cases such as these?
Yes. I just wanted to add that one shortcoming in terms of the PWDBA also is that, and for someone who's been in SDBV response work with the criminal justice system, right, as in all wings of that or verticals of that, and not only the courts, one of the biggest shortcomings with the PWDBA, right, in terms of right to residence, as Vasudha was pointing out, is also this entire thing of the way the law got worded. There is endless, infinite debatability of the term shared household, which is also what we find in a lot of cases, not just we, as in I don't just mean me and my workplaces or ex-workplaces or whatever, but a lot of our feminist lawyer friends in Lawyers Collective, etc., have found in a lot of their cases is that the Taruna Batra judgment, which was around 2010, I think, Delhi, in a Delhi court, that kind of defanged the law, because they ruled that because the man had never, as Vasudha pointed out, he didn't have a house of his own, and their ruling was that the woman did not have the right to residence in her marital home, as in her in-laws' home, because the son had the argument made in court was that the husband had never actually lived there for a prolonged period of time. It was only the daughter-in-law who had lived there. So the thing with the law itself is, with the PWDV Act, is while it offers all those civil reliefs, and it was built for that, the problem is the Indian judicial system is such that once a higher court gives a certain kind of reading or judgment, especially in the early years of the implementation of the law, when most judges don't even know what the law is about, right? They have to be briefed by the woman's lawyer in the break, before their thing is heard. In such cases, what happens is that a problematic judgment becomes the precedence for all courts then, until someone even higher in a later judgment gives a better judgment, right? And you have to have a very specialist judge in that case, or bench or whatever. So that is a big shortcoming in terms of the things that the law addresses. And the second point very quickly is that as long as restitution of conjugal rights exists for the Indian husband, as long as that exists, you can have, compensation, maintenance, interim, temporary, you can have custody of children, you can have everything, protection orders, right to residence, everything possible. But while that concept illegally exists of restitution of conjugal rights, it is very hard to safeguard, right, guarantee, as you said, the woman's rights. So until that goes, we can have lots of other things that, as Vasudha pointed out, Indira Jaising, Anjali, the way everybody fights for, brings into the law, but it doesn't change much substantively until restitution of conjugal rights does not go.
Thank you for that, Taranga. That's actually going to bring me to a point that we will discuss a little further into the podcast. But before that, Vasudha, you had mentioned something about acceptable violence. So, regarding that, does the court make a distinction between acceptable and unacceptable violence when it comes to something like marital rape, when it says that marital rape is not rape? And it has held that by marriage, a wife consents to sex with her husband through this concept of irrefutable consent, unless she is under the age of 15. Now, what is the logic guiding such jurisprudence as seen in Article 375? And what were the suggestions proposed by the 42nd Law Commission and the dissenting J.S. Verma report from 2012? Where has the debate progressed in both the legislature as well as the judiciary?
Right. So this basically comes from the idea that marriage is a contract and the consent is implied. It's from the feudal idea that woman is the man's property, and therefore once she has consented to marrying him, there is no refusal on any kind of sexual activity going on between them. And another notion that, all along, as you may have come across also, is said that, in case this is criminalized, then considering the nature of marriage, proving this will be very difficult, and therefore it may be misused, is an argument which is often put forward. But it was basically derived from the common law, which at that point held that, since it's a it's a contract, she has to consent to the sexual activity. That's where it was brought in from. However, most of the countries have now repealed or abolished the matrimonial rape. So currently, India is among the only few countries which still continues to uphold this, patriarchal law. And while new laws have been brought in with BNS, the section is now 63, it still holds this exception. Now, only that age from 15, they've made it to 18. These are basically the 3 criminal laws that were brought in, which replaced the older IPC, CRPC, and Evidence Act. So we're still grappling and, learning our way around it. Basically, with this new law coming in, they didn't change much. On the face of it, it is showing that, they are done with colonial practices, and that's why they have brought in names, which are Bharatiya Nyaya, Sanchita, and Sakshi, which is evidence. However, they have only rearranged the sections. They have moved it from one place to another without really making any changes to the practices which are deeply colonial.
Right.
So that only on the face of it to, just maybe show that, the government has basically brought in certain changes. They have done this entire exercise, but it's actually, it only takes us back, because now the judiciary is burdened with, learning just new numbers, while in practice there is no change. In J.S. Verma report, basically they had relied on other jurisdiction and held that the relationship between the accused and the victim is immaterial when it comes to sexual violence. And therefore, this should be read down, this particular exception. And basically it had directed that we should no longer continue with marital rape being an exception under the general rape, which was under 376, which is now under section 63. Also, section 67 has been brought in, which says that if there has been a judicial separation between a couple, or they have been living separately, after that, if a woman claims, if there is any sort of marital rape, then that will be punishable under for 2 to 7 years. However, this has been brought in with new law, so how it will pan out in practice is something we'll still have to see. And currently, basically there is a petition which is before the Supreme Court, which is to decide the constitutionality of restitution of marital rape. So, in Karnataka, there's this judgment, Rishikesh Sahu versus State of Karnataka, where the wife had claimed that, while she had made her other grounds, she had also filed for rape before the session court. And there was also a POCSO matter going on. And then this was challenged in High Court, saying that since since they are married, he, under the exceptions, such a petition cannot lie against him. But the High Court of Karnataka held that no, there can be no exception under law, which is so absolute that it becomes a license for commission of crime. And they held him guilty. They said that such a petition can lie against him. So then he filed a SLP before the Supreme Court challenging the Karnataka High Court judgment.
What's the SLP?
It's a special leave petition which has been filed before Supreme Court, challenging the judgment of Karnataka High Court. At the same time, there was also in Delhi, there was a petition which was made which said that which contested the marital rape exception, and even that it was a division bench gave a split verdict, where one of the judge held that the women's autonomy is far more important, and the other judge held that the institution of marriage and the sanctity of marriage etc. needs to be held, and once within a marriage, whether consented or non-consented, it still remains an exception because of the nature of the relationship that they share. So that has also been challenged in Supreme Court. So now all of these petitions which have been separately filed are clubbed together. They were supposed to be heard last year, but because the Chief Justice was retiring and the bench was not in place, it's now been, hopefully it should come up sometime this year. The Union of India has filed an affidavit, from their end, saying that why this exception should remain, and that's the first time that the union has actually out, because so far the judges have, there has been no discussion about this exception, but the union has come forward with an affidavit saying why this exception should remain. So once the hearing begins, we'll get a better idea.
All right. Thank you. Now to Taranga. Protection of women and children is a priority, but condemning every marriage as violent and every man as a rapist is not advisable. It's something that the Minister for Women and Child Development said in response to the Communist Party of India Member of Parliament on the supplementary query raised on the issue of marital rape in the Rajya Sabha. Well, it also goes on to say everything has pros and cons. Many people believe that if punishment for marital rape is introduced, it can be misused for trapping men against false allegation. Now, what is this ghost of false rape cases when the burden of proof already lies on the survivor as a legal antagonism? And how does it influence or is influenced by rape culture in Indian society? Has medical jurisprudence evolved with time or come under feminist scrutiny?
I'm going to start with connecting this to my thoughts on your previous question to Vasudha, and what Vasudha had ended with talking about, the union's response, right? In the
affidavit,
exception challenging petition. First of all, we have to understand that what essentially the union is saying in this current response, as well as the erstwhile Minister of WCD was saying, is essentially they're saying that it's up to Parliament as the representatives of the people to do anything about this, and we are taking the position very officially of the patriarchal Indian society. Right, where again women's bodies are considered property of the husband, and we believe that there should be restitution of conjugal rights. We believe that marital rape should be exempted from sexual violence, all other sexual violence laws, because of that proprietorial right, socio-legally determined, by our society. So in this situation, what essentially happens is that to make it look like it's based on data, which is how Parliament works. And I'm saying this as someone who's worked in a ministry also, right, for years, that when a question is asked in Lok Sabha, especially by an opposition MP, then they ask you questions with data, right? That there are these many cases of, violence by a husband, let's say taking, again, I don't know, but Lawyers Collective or HRLN or someone else's data and saying, look, there were so many DIRs, domestic incidents reports under the PWDVA, saying that there was sexual violence within the marriage. So what are you doing about this marital rape exception, right, in the law? And what the state then is saying is essentially that no, but there are so many false rape cases. And it's very interesting to see that it has been actually, if you look at the whole men's rights activism in Parliament over the last decade and a half, it's been led by a couple of BJP MPs, especially from from the central part of the country. Especially there was this one person from Madhya Pradesh, I will remember the name and tell you, who had pushed for even when even for 498A, right, which is dowry related torture and extreme cruelty. It's cruelty to women within a marriage by her marital relatives, including her husband. They had sought successfully the Parliamentary Legal Affairs Committee to advocate for changes in the implementation of 498A, just for cruelty within the marital family, right? And what happens then is that even that guy, I remember he had said, I have over 1 lakh men who have come to me in distress. It was in the news and all of that. This is around maybe 2012, 13, 14-ish, yeah? And it was big in the news that he had made this claim and he had gone to the Parliamentary Legal Committee, that Legal Affairs Committee, that I have over 1 lakh men, you know, who are being falsely accused. Now, the thing is that as someone providing, mostly involved in doing psychosocial and therefore legal assistance aid work with domestic violence survivors, one finds that less than 3% of women who come to such services, who seek services, right, help from some registered or government or other body in cases of domestic violence, less than 3% of them have ever sought any help before. Yeah, out of that, there is some 0.3% who have actually filed some form of civil or legal help ke liye an application. So whether a domestic incidents report after DV Act came in, or even a diary entry in a police station saying that my husband has thrown me out of the house in the middle of the night with the children, or whatever else it is, right? And after intervention by some service provider, then even fewer, only about 4% of them pursue any kind of legal, whether civil or criminal legal action process. Most women who face domestic violence do not want criminalization. What they want is protection, right, from further violence. They want an end to recidivism. And in my ex-workplace, for example, in the Special Cells for Women work, we had even written an entire paper looking at 534 such processes, intervention processes across the state of Maharashtra, where we found that most women, all they wanted was a Sukhicha Sansar. Yeah, so this bogey of false rape cases, there is no actual data. All right, false rape, false 498A, false anything, there is no actual data. So let me start with making that clear. The second point being that, and this is something I say in training to public prosecutors, to police, to doctors, to everyone else, right, that as per the Supreme Court guidelines of 2012, no police is supposed to refuse to take a complaint from a woman or a child. They are supposed to take her complaint as it is, and based on some very preliminary investigation, they are supposed to put the relevant charges. Yeah. Now it is the courts that decide, as Vasudha had pointed out also, whether it is actually punishable under that particular charge, right? So in the end, 99.99% of the time, whether under civil laws like DV Act or criminal laws like 498A, etc., it is the woman, survivor, or sometimes a victim, someone who has died due to the entire process of violence, is never a beneficiary of that process in any way. So the motivation for filing false cases is also very, very, it's negligible. Yeah, it makes more sense for a woman to apply for maintenance or custody of her children than to put a false criminal case. And this bogey being shown by all these people in Parliament or to the Supreme Court now of false cases is that, oh, men will be criminalized. Men are not being criminalized. All right, men are not being criminalized so easily, and definitely not by the women or children that they are perpetrating violence on, because that criminalization gets them nothing. For example, we had done a study again in the Special Cells work with other women's movements, NGOs, etc. in Rajasthan, looking at closed 498A cases. And we found that in 99.99% cases, okay, the woman was either living in her natal home after that case was filed, or she had disappeared. Disappeared means she was no longer You could not find her at marital or natal home anymore. So most likely she was dead. You see what I'm saying? So there is this notion of a criminal case or criminalization of a man leading to some kind of mass oppression of women is not real in terms of any data. A third problem is even in criminal cases, 498, POXO, whatever else you see. Yeah, even in criminal cases, there is again very often the problem with successful prosecution of that case and sentencing is due to various people within that criminal justice system. Yeah, if a police wala, and we've seen this again, there's much documentation around this. If police wala, right, decides that he wants to take, or the lawyer, even the lawyer, right, decides that they do, ata sata in this case, which is that they decide that we will put names of, some nanad who is living in Dubai, sister-in-law living in Dubai, some mother-in-law living in Kerala. The case is filed where? Somewhere in Parbhani or Nagpur or somewhere in, in the heart of Maharashtra, that we will put all of them in this 498A case. Yeah, we will put their names in the charge sheet, and then we will either take money from the family, the man's family, to get those names removed, or else we will let it go like that, and then the woman will lose the case, because obviously there is no evidence of those people being. And the same thing then applies even at forensic level, since you talked about medical jurisprudence, since doctors refuse to give even injury certificates. It's happened to me in a student's case where I was working in the past. The on-campus doctor, this young woman was slapped by her ex-boyfriend who had come onto campus. She came to our office on campus, and the doctor who was on campus refused to give an injury certificate, though his entire hand was literally printed red on his face after that. She refused to give an injury certificate, right? So there is forensic issues, there is doctor issues, there are protection officer issues in most of the states in India. Protection officers are given additional charge of 5 different other schemes, so they cannot do the detailed work of doing DIR, preparing the Form 2 and Form 7 appeals for the woman properly, recording all her details, doing safety planning for her. They don't do that. Then, of course, you get to the court, as Vasudha pointed out, right? Where judges then have differing opinions. And it's easy for them because, again, the state and the law are unchanging in this respect. Yeah. So this entire thing of false, people will be falsely accused, is not raised for anything else except for violence on women and children. You see, it's not raised for anything else. This bogey is not being raised for anything else. They will keep passing. First there was TADA, then there was POTA, then now there is UAPA, and it's become worse in the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita, as Vasudha pointed out, right? Some things have become even worse. Yeah. But nobody is saying that, somebody will be falsely. No, nobody is worried about men being falsely accused there. It's only, if you notice, historically, only with SGBV related addressing laws.
Moving slightly ahead to once again talk about the criminalization of marital rape, what were the recommendations of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also commonly known as CEDAW, and how have feminist social workers made progress in advocating for the criminalization of marital rape?
Okay, I'll give very quick, because I've done a lot of CEDAW training, and a good reference material for anyone listening to your podcast is to read this feminist legal organization named Partners for Law and Development in Delhi, Madhu Mehra. They've come out with a beautiful publication on CEDAW, right, with illustrations and everything. It's beautiful, it's excellent to use to understand, and also, of course, I've used it a lot in training people on CEDAW, right, especially within the state system. So essentially, what the CEDAW it mandates for all the countries who are signatories to it, including India, is that the state, each of these nation states, and therefore their apparatus, must do 3-4 main things. One is that they must mainstream issues of gender within all program, policy, law, mechanisms. So gender budgeting, right? which became a huge thing in around 2005-6 in India for central and state governments down to the village panchayat level. That is an example of that, right? That mainstream gender thinks that all kinds of policies, money, allocations, everything possible to ensure that women enjoy full freedom from discrimination that they have historically faced. The second thing, therefore, is affirmative action, right? So have reservation for women in jobs, in education, in elected representation, right? Politics, an area in which India is still lagging behind because you still don't have it, right? In the Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha. So all of these things put together, yeah. Then the third is affirmative action. The third thing is very specifically reporting back to the global community of nation states and having aid and mutual cooperation hanging on or conditional on how much they have fulfilled. So every year, earlier it used to be Dr. Shanta Sinha here only in Bangalore, NIAS, who used to compile the entire report for India. So every year, how much you spent on women and their empowerment, their protection, their safety, everything, all activities you did on gigantic, like on set of encyclopedias, has to be presented by India to United Nations to receive multilateral or bilateral funding and support, have trade agreements continuing, lots of things, yeah. And the fourth most important thing, to have very specific legal or criminal justice system mechanisms, including laws and schemes, right, to address the effects of patriarchal violence on women. So these are the main things which then women's movements across the world, and by the way, it took 3 years, okay, for CEDAW to be signed and ratified. It took 3 entire years in the UN. Most nation states did not want to be signatories. USA, for example, is still the biggest non-signatory. Basically what helped women's movements, especially from the global south, most countries which had only relatively recently had won independence, right, between the 40s to the 70s, that from colonial or imperial rule, etc. What it helped them do is go back and demand context-specific work by the states, nation states, by the governments in their own respective countries. So that is essentially what CEDAW's recommendations are. Yeah?
Yeah. Also, the second part of the question is, how have feminist social workers made progress in advocating for criminalization of marital rape? Has there been any interplay between CEDAW and advocacy on this front?
So feminist social workers are, as you know from some of our background conversation to this and previous interactions, feminist social workers are actually in that sense fairly marginalized within the larger advocacy discourse, right? There is feminist psychologists, academics, especially feminist academics and lawyers have historically, to see, like Vasudha had pointed out, from the Bhavik Devi gang rape case, Mathura rape case times to till now, have always, obviously for obvious reasons, had greater visibility and acceptability with the state, yeah, and so they have been able to successfully lead all legal reforms, campaigns, advocacy, etc. However, I would say, in my experience as a feminist social worker for 20 years, one thing I have observed is that I think that feminist legal work in India did not focus enough for a good part of post-PWDVA achievement, did not focus enough on marital rape exception challenging. What there was a lot of discussion around was on having a separate law criminalizing marital rape, which we as feminist social workers were very clear that it was always going to be a non-starter. Yeah, because that is how many individual tiny, it's like, I remember a few years ago there was Swara Bhaskar and a few other people said that we need an anti-mob lynching law in India. There are those sections, just like there is already for sexual violence. And in fact, in the December 2000, post the December 2012 Delhi gang rape case, based on Justice Verma committee's recommendations and a lot of movements and all of that and representations to government, there were amendments even to Section 354, right, which were ones that we wanted. We wanted it to stop being only penetrative penovaginal sexual assault being termed as sexual violence. We wanted voyeurism, acid attacks, stalking, all those to be brought in as sexual violence. So the thing is that I think that there was a missed opportunity of about a decade of listening to what feminist social workers were saying, which is very clearly that restitution of conjugal rights and the marital rape exception, that these are on an existing continuum of women being treated as property within marriage, right, in our nation's political economy, including the law as an institution. And to break that, you need to do what we did with Section 354, that kind of advocacy, which is that we need to work with the existing law and not fight for or ruminate on should we fight for a separate law. Because like I said anyway, having a separate law to penalize people and have new definitions of what exactly marital rape means. See, sexual violence within marriage is sexual violence. There is only the question of consent or not consent. All sexual violence is that only. It's not something special and different, except for in the eyes of social legal institutions like community and parliament and the courts.
Right.
Common law. Otherwise, in practice, for feminist social workers, there is no difference. So I do feel that there was that missed opportunity, and I'm happy that now the people like Advocate Karuna Nandi, etc., have taken the marital rape exception petition specifically to the top courts, and we hope that that I wish and pray that somebody also then also talks about removing this restitution of conjugal rights, because without that you can't really, again, there will be this marital rape exception. Even if it's struck down, you're not going to have people stop forcing women to live with violent men just because they're their husband socially.
Right. That is very true.
Talking about one more thing with marital rape that I want to add is that the idea of rape that we have is, that there'll be a stranger, who will... Rape is a crime which happens between closed doors. So, most women are most vulnerable to actually their partners, which may be their boyfriends, husbands, or at max their, employers. We have laws for other things, but for husbands, there's still, nothing in place. It comes under an exception, while they are the most vulnerable there.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, actually. So, Vasudha, also with regard to the split between the Special Marriage Act as well as personal laws that govern marriage, India has a combination of both that govern marriage. So, what are the features of each, and how does going about seeking a divorce differ when you choose to marry under one or the other? There is a common understanding that maybe marrying under the Special Marriage Act might be more beneficial for some people, but is that a myth?
So mostly, see, for getting married, these acts are, fairly different, because for other laws, you have to be from the same faith to get married. For Hindu, both the people need to be Hindu. For Special Marriage Act, it's a civil marriage, so it can be registered by people. It's mostly for interfaith marriages, and it's still a better way to go about it, because less religious intervention even on the face of it. But when it comes to divorce, the codified law that we have, which is the Hindu Marriage Act, and it's not starkly different. The process is still the same. The grounds are also fairly, there is no under these, the personal laws, there's also a ground where, if somebody ceases to be of that religion, under Indian Divorce Act also, if you cease to be a Christian, then you can seek a divorce under that ground also. But in practice, mostly if it's a contested divorce, then when you go to file, then the ground will more likely either be desertion or cruelty or adultery. So those rarely come into play. So I would say, that special marriage, assuming that the process of divorce will be different under Special Marriage Act, is a myth, because it's fairly same. There is no, apart from the sections being here and there, the law is similar for all, be it Hindu Marriage Act or Special Marriage Act or Indian Divorce Act.
Thank you for that. So now let's move on to talking about the restitution of conjugal rights. We've addressed that at different points in this podcast, but never really talked about it in depth. So, historically, the Delhi High Court in the case of Harvinder Kaur versus Harmandir Singh and the Andhra Pradesh High Court in the case of T. Sarita versus T. Venkata Subbaiah have set two contrasting precedents. Can forcefully mandating a woman to enter a potentially non-consensual sexual relationship be dictated by the court, even under the logic of reasonable differentiator, as noted in Saroja Rani versus Sudarshan Kumar Chadha?
Yeah, I'm not obviously the correct person to answer the question about what a reasonable differentiator is, but that I will leave to Achudha. But yes, I mean, since I've been saying restitution of conjugal rights is a problem for ages, basically what it does, this entire thing, the entire provision of restitution of conjugal rights is essentially that I'm saying this in practice, right, as we experience from the survivor side, like when we are supporting the survivor. Basically, when a woman says that for whatever, all these various violence or even non-violence reasons, right, that says, I am leaving this cohabiting relationship, this shared household with the husband, I am leaving it and going away and I am not coming back, right? Then the man, the husband, can go to court saying that my conjugal rights, that means literally, as far as I know, the law is worded as saying that the right to live in close proximity with my spouse. Yeah, which means basically to share the same household, share the same bed, etc. It's still, as Asudha has pointed out, very colonially nice, like that language, which makes it look like, it's everything except what it actually is. That is what, that you please, direct my wife to come live with me again. Now, no, you are right that the state actually cannot coerce a woman into going back to live with him. Yeah, the court gives an order, and calls the woman or her lawyer, her representative, whoever, and the man in court and says, please go live with him. Yeah, now the woman may not go back. But what restitution of conjugal rights provides for also is that if she refuses to go back, then the man can appeal to the court that you please attach her property. So that means essentially that, if she has, let's say her parents had gifted her a home, all right, at the time of marriage or even before marriage, or if, she had bought a house of her own, right, there's the possibility she can go and live there. Yeah, and she has that space, so she doesn't have to come back to this person's, the shared household. So then attach that property of hers. It's like holding her ransom. Yeah. Now, the thing is that what one needs, and this is why you need social workers and counselors who are informed of the law, understand the criminal justice system, can plan with the woman. Essentially, what you need is that you need to help the woman figure out which of her assets, her things that she is okay with losing control to until through PWDBA, a contested divorce that she files for, etc., whatever else it is, that she can get control of that again. Until then, it will not be in her. Yeah. So the good thing about PWDBA, one of the reasons why it was fought for was precisely so that a woman can have a protection order also. Not only a right to residence order, but a protection order. So we know so many cases where our friends from Lawyers Collective and HRLN have intervened, where they even where there was a restitution of conjugal rights order prior, and the woman's native family or her own financial circumstances were not allowing her to stay in peace outside, and the man was saying, there was a case that Advocate Monica Sakrani had shared once in the training with us, where she said that the man in court said he had a good job, a corporate job, like he was earning 60,000-70,000 a month. He said, I will quit this job, but I won't give maintenance. You see?
Yeah, that's a fairly common...
He quit the job. So then the woman can't even survive outside. So then under the PWDBA, what you do is you file for a right to residence, but also protection order, which there are very good cases. I think Indra Jaising had also put together a huge edited compendium of such examples where, that in the shared household, there are particular timings when the woman will use the kitchen, then nobody from the Marathi family should go in at that time, and, all of those things. And if the protection order is violated, nobody will enter the room that is hers, her and her children's, things like that. So nobody will keep her children away from her. So all of those things are there, and if it's violated, then you go back to court or go to the police or homeguards are sent, etc. So वो सब है, that is there, yes, it's there, but restitution of conjugal rights is essentially the law, the state and society through law saying that a man can ask the state and society to hold the woman ransom to living with him, just because of this socio-legal institution of marriage. That's it.
Right. So, I just wanted her to begin with because I thought she has a better idea of how on ground this unfolds. In my experience, I'll start with, so the restitution of conjugal rights, on the value of it is a gender neutral. Like, women can also file against man and the man can also file against the woman. But in practice, rarely, two women go about filing this restitution of conjugal rights. It's usually only, and court have also taken note of this, which is what brings me to the judgment, which was in the Andhra Pradesh High Court. The court had held that this section 9 of Hindu Marriage Act, which is of restitution of conjugal rights, is in violation of Article 14 and 21 of Constitution. It is against her right to live, and basically the court it had upheld the autonomy of women and held that no court can force her to go and live where she doesn't want to. This was somewhere in 1980s. Simultaneously in Delhi High Court, it was, in Harvinder Kaur, it was basically, the other argument is that everybody wants to protect the sanctity of marriage over the right of woman, where they say, for the welfare of society, for the welfare of children, etc., it's advisable that, the family retain together and, they work through their way around rather than, one of the partners leaving, which is what was held in that judgment. And this was further confirmed in Supreme Court in Saroj Rani. In Saroj Rani, what they said was the basic element of a marriage is husband and wife living together. The companionship, or basically living in the same place. So when one of the partners, which in most cases would be wife, who may leave for violence and for a lot of reasons, once she leaves, basically that marriage crumbles down, and this leads to irretrievable breakdown of marriage. To hold a marriage together, if they strike down the restitution of conjugal rights, in that case, it will directly have an impact on the institution of marriage, which is why, the court held that there is nothing unconstitutional about that section. It's because that section also, their argument was also that section says that without reasonable ground if somebody leaves. But the problem there is that the person who is leaving has to prove, the burden is on that person to prove that, they have left, they have left for some kind of reason. So that also puts onus on the woman. And there should be no law telling you what you can and what you cannot, where you can live and where you cannot live. So currently, there have been, a petition has also been filed against this. There's a PIL which has been filed by, Gujarat Law University. Ojaswa Pathak is the name of that case. It's before, it's still pending. In that, they have also relied on all these three judgments, where they have also brought in saying that the earlier Supreme Court judgment in Saroj Rani may have been okay. At that time the judgment may have been passed, but since then, things have drastically changed. We have the Puttaswamy judgment, which brings in the right to privacy and the personal autonomy and dignity of the, person needs to be valued more than the social structure of marriage. And they have also, placed a line. They have said that, while on the face of it, it allows the husband and wife both to file, but in practice, it has been noted by courts also that only husbands file restitution of conjugal rights. So therefore, it also is, an oppressive law which has been used against women.
Yeah, you would know how I would hope for that to go, and wish everyone good luck in that case. But talking about all of this has highlighted the violence inherent in all of these structures where first you have to prove that there was any kind of marital rape, or if you are a woman filing for divorce, you have to you have to prove grounds upon which you want to get divorced. It's not just granted as an adult who chooses to no longer remain in a social legal relationship. But as Indian patriarchy goes, it is a deeply casteist society as well. So there are institutions that can be mobilized against the safety of the woman should she also choose to file for divorce in the first place. So, to Taranga, what does safety planning look like in the face of a court order like this, and when a woman anticipates domestic violence? So, how frequently do women know that they can appeal against this decision of restitution of conjugal rights, and how does class location factor into whether the appeal gets made at all?
Right. So as I partially answered this already, which is that, safety planning in this situation, one is that if women had access to all these existing schemes and programs and, people like the protection officer or the police station based counselor or the social worker in a family counseling center or the OSC, right? One stop center, which was the big flagship scheme of the current regime when it came into power first, etc. That if women had enough awareness of all of these structures to help them plan exiting a violent marriage or even just a violent household. Right? It's not just about a violent marriage, it's also about exiting a violent household. You could be living, your husband may be a migrant working and living with a second wife in some big city, and we found this so much when we did work in Bihar, right? Interventions work, that there were so many women who were living with their in-laws, and that is the violent household they wanted to exit. They didn't even care whether the marriage existed or not, right, anymore on paper, or what were their rights within that, because nothing was accruing to them from that marriage. They were supporting this household also, they were doing, facing the violence. They just wanted their own life with their kids or without their kids. Many of them didn't have kids because husband had always been away and had to set up a second family somewhere else. And it's true, I'm talking about this, it's not just that stereotype that you have, it's true even today, right? Like, this is very current work. So again, that so one is that women should know that all these services, schemes, all of these people exist. You can go to them, and those people also should not be additional charge, right? So protection officers, if you look in most states in the country, still have additional charge of multiple other schemes. Like in Maharashtra, for example, we had to fight so much, all of us feminist service providers, to get the Department of the Commissioner of WCD to take away the rape compensation scheme, dowry prohibition officer, and multiple other schemes as implementation, which required a lot of paperwork away from the protection officers. Because the protection officers under the DV Act, which, as I pointed out in the earlier answer, helps with safety planning for a woman, right? That is part of the law. It's there. There's a format for safety planning. There's a process. They're trained in it, or at least supposed to be trained in it. That also, a protection officer is also the program manager for the OSC, which is also known as the helpline in Bihar since forever, and in Jharkhand also. In Jharkhand, they didn't have designated protection officers until a couple of years ago, right? When Ali went to work there, Ali and UNFPA. So one is what charge, are they paid enough? Family counseling centers, special cell social workers are exceedingly underpaid for people with MA degrees, right? MA in social work, MA in psychology, many of them are lawyers themselves, people like me, right? Getting paid 8,000 rupees, 6,000 rupees a month, 15,000 rupees a month. So one is that you don't have enough people, you don't pay them enough, don't put enough. Same for OSC. It's all being run through the monitoring of local NGOs, and those NGOs are changed repeatedly. Yeah, so then again, you can have 20 staff and Nirbhaya dashboard and whatnot in the one-stop center in each district in India, but it doesn't help because those people are not trained enough or not paid enough. Yeah. So again, what actually, and I have felt this for a long time, that what India actually needs is a constitutional or legal guarantee for every survivor of violence for access to social services and quality social services. What we need is a law for that. Like there is actually something like that in the UK. Yeah. Which actually Anjali Dave and Indra Jaising had studied. They had visited the UK before they, together drafted all of them together drafted the PWDBA. But of course, that never came into this, into this country. That kind of thinking. A third thing, like I said, is how much feminist service providers, feminist interventionists, how much, whether lawyers or doctors or whoever else, or social workers or psychologists, how much we get to repeatedly train these people. Yeah, train service providers, monitor, and through grant and aid run those programs. Yeah, because we have the ideological and the experiential base to do that. The state does not have it. Yeah, a changing WCD minister, depending on the current regime every time, is not going to be able to ensure quality. A fourth thing that is missing again, and especially for women who rely on public services, right, which do not cost extra money, yeah, is also, or do not live in urban areas, etc., is also that we don't have a set curriculum, okay, for responding to sexual and gender-based violence, or even other based on other intersectionalities, other kinds of identity-based hate crimes and violence. We don't have a set training curriculum for all people in sarkari positions across the country. Yeah, we don't have that. It's something that in my ex-workplace we pushed for a long time. Like my dream is someday, I don't know, but I get to, there is somebody who is like a real approachable candidate for the Prime Minister of India. I will want to go and give this proposal to them. You see what I'm saying? Because it's, what do you do when you meet a woman who is surviving violence but needs that violence to stop? That is something which everyone needs. So these are all the things that are barriers, since that was the second part of your question. But to answer the first part, one is that you need people to be able to plan with the woman before she exits the violent marriage or the violent household, even if it's a natal household. And two, you need not only legal, but you need a lot of other mechanisms and infrastructure to be put into place, like things like proper witness protection, proper long-term shelter which allows children also. You need a lot of other things post the actual exit, right? So all of this put together would be safety planning. Those are the holes that we are all sitting and filling. Whether you are a lawyer in an NGO or whether you are a feminist social worker, whoever you are, right? You are plugging these gaps by making the woman, the survivor, aware of her options, helping her plan all this such that out of 10 things, she can identify 10 things that she wants, and we can secure at least one or two, and we can secure her continued safety. So that is what safety planning essentially is. For example, in this whole restitution of conjugal rights wala thing that Vasudha had talked about, right? We very often find that in cases where the man and the woman are living separately, there are criminal and divorce cases and maintenance proceedings, everything is going on, right? Who ends up with all of the Stridhan? The Stridhan meaning all the things that the woman was gifted at the time of marriage, and also her own assets, which are sometimes most valuable. Her silk saris, her jewelry, her all her bhandi, bartan, okay, the furniture that she bought, the appliances that came into the shared household with the Marathi family during the marriage or through her own efforts. All of those things you will see lying in the economic offences wing or the crime against women wing offices. At ACP level, if it's big enough, like in Delhi and Bombay, etc., if that office is big enough, and you will very often find that, a DYSP, an SP, an ACP, the TV, the giant flat screen TV they have in their office has the tag with the number, the evidence number. Why? Because all that Stridhan is ending up in the position of the use of the state ultimately. Yeah. So to be able to plan with a woman, yeah, that she can get all of this back, or that she can bear the burden of forever hard doing weight. This is an English language. So washing her hands off, forgetting of that she will ever get any of that, right? Doing that planning with the woman, make sure that when you exit the household, no matter how bad the fight is, you have your bank passbook, your debit cards, your certificates, your passport, your Aadhaar card, you have your children's school books, right? Because many women are too poor to even buy school books, for their children. They'll take their children and go, but do you have it all in a bag? Or when you are being thrown out of the house, are you able to carry all those non-negotiable things with you, so that it does not become a question of going back to that household and being vulnerable to violence again, because you couldn't, or your children losing their admission, on losing out on their studies. All of those things, that doing all of that is safety planning. Also helping them file for a protection order in court immediately under the DV Act, that is also safety planning. So telling them that these are all your options and hand-holding them through accessing all those options, doing that planning, all of this is safety planning that can be done, should be done, ideally.
Also, in light of everything that we've talked about, we see how all of this violence is systemic. And systemic violence, as Yuvindhya mentions in her essay Battered Conjugality, The Psychology of Domestic Violence, has been measured to have implications in the sphere of economic development, because, of course, women are economic subjects just the same as men. So, do you think feminization of labor has an impact on women's ability to escape domestic violence? Since neoliberalism has not been able to solve for this problem by being beneficiaries of wage theft, how have women, according to you and in your experience, been able to escape the psychological violence of domestic assault or battery in unfavorable material conditions?
See, I'll say that in the past decade now, I have seen that there is less stigma around divorce and separation, where the woman was either had the support of her natal family, which was able to financially support her, or if the woman was leaving very early in the marriage, very, very early in the marriage. Like, I've seen police women saying that it's good that she left within 2-3 months of just getting married, so there are no issues. And by issues, they don't only mean no children, but so there are things that are changing in big ways, and imperceptibly perhaps to the rest of society. But for, interventionists like Vasudha and me, yes, we do see that there are things that are changing in terms of how much taboo that or stigma there is around divorce per se. But I will also say that, and especially if the woman can earn herself, right, then divorce is looked upon fine. Like, you see that there are plenty of actresses, right, who are divorced, and even recently they are not they don't stop getting work because of that or whatever, right? They remain their fans. People look up to them as models of strength and whatnot, all of that. Yes, there is less stigma around divorce, yes. But the financial implications for most women, the financial implications are part of the larger psychological trauma of having faced and even survived domestic violence. So it's not, how do I put this? So it's not exactly that the ability to go out and get a job or continue your job even in a very a liberal or progressive workplace, in a corporate environment or something else, that does not necessarily protect you from the psychological impact of having survived domestic violence itself. Domestic violence in itself is a breach of trust. It's and there is a breach of there's a violation of your own integrity as a person, especially when there's sexual violence, because your invitation to us to speak to you for this recording was also in the context of, again, that what is the kind of sexual violence which is considered acceptable within a marriage led to the death of a woman, but the man gets off from the charge of wanting wantonly carrying out that violence, which anyone would expect that if a woman did that to a man, right? It's not it's not considered a natural right. Yeah. So if she did it to the man, it would be a clear. Everyone would say, "What did she want to kill him or what?" Right? I mean, easily a murder case could be put on her. So there is no natural right there, and that experience itself, which leads to even a woman being able to exit a marriage, a violent marriage, it is also very material in that sense. It affects your ability to continue at work. It affects your ability to earn. It affects also your ability to then decide. The same society will support you if you leave a violent husband or a drunkard, useless, jobless husband. Yes, maybe they will support you, right? But what they won't necessarily support is if you decide that children should be left in the custody of the marital family. I don't want the children also. Yeah, so then there is this additional financial implication then of being responsible and fighting for maintenance. You see, because you can't necessarily give your children the same upbringing entirely on your own, even though you could support yourself. So neoliberalization or feminization of labor do not solve at any point, right, for reducing the impact of domestic violence, whether psychological or material. It only in very material ways, it exacerbates the psychological impact of having even gone through and survived what other people would call a success story. Even that, it very much affects that. There is no happily smiling woman who is still fighting a maintenance case or a long pending custody case or whatever else. Even a rich one who has a career and is well known and can afford to fight it's not easy, and is educated and has a good job. It's not there is no that picture that they show now. Like, what is this film they're discussing currently? That very popular, Mrs. Correct. Yeah, so I haven't watched the full thing in Hindi because I was irritated at it being remade. But if you see, even for the Malayalam original, which is amazing, but at the end of it, for me, the shortcoming of Geo Baby as a man making that film was, they showed the entire thing of, social reproduction and the burden of it on the woman and how it's violent, everything, sexual violence within the marriage, everything they showed. But they showed that the second that you break that, the protagonist, the woman, I don't use the word heroine, that when she breaks that and she walks out, then after that, the next shot is straight cutting to her happily continuing giving dance classes in a fancy, amphitheater or auditorium or something. But it doesn't work like that. It's not that woman does not end up being like that. And it doesn't happen just because you broke the vicious cycle of being stuck in a violent home or in a violent family. It doesn't work like that. So, of course, neoliberalization, globalization, none of these, the feminization of labor, none of these solve for, in that sense, it just makes divorce slightly less of a taboo if you have a job or are easily employable. But it does not necessarily, it does not make the psychological impact or the material impact of domestic violence any less. It does not.
Yeah, so talking about how the social deeply impacts and influences how you experience violence, I'm ending this podcast with my final question now to Taranga, and of course Vasudha, you can come in here because we will be talking about a case that was in the courts and how the courts behaved towards it. In the infamous Roop Kanwar case, people of the Rajput community alleged that her undertaking sati was voluntary, and that led to eulogizing and ceremonial memorialization of violence against her personhood, which was read as the ideal act of a devoted wife, despite dubious legality. Now, given that discussions on rape in the courtroom are often referred to as anything but rape, and the rape of Jyoti Singh, whom everyone was intent on calling Nirbhaya, for being raped and not surviving it, because had she survived and had she been a living woman, she would have faced a lot of stigma. This was back in 2012. So, would a change in the legal status of marital rape lead to more reporting of the instance if India still views all issues of sexual violence or sex in general as taboo? Or will they celebrate a woman's silence once it is criminalized, contributing to very little change on ground?
So, I'll answer the last bit first. I mean, from whatever I have seen, we can bring in all the laws that we like and we can bring in all the legislations. But it will not make, I mean, on paper, it can make some difference, but it will not make a major difference until, we as a society are also accepting of it. It is a step. I mean, it will, criminalizing marital rape obviously is a very, very progressive step. But even then, if the police is not recording your FIR, which they more often than not don't, even in cruelty they don't, then getting that in place is still very difficult. Or if you somehow manage to do that and you reach the court and the judiciary will still hold the same, notions that they have held so far, that since it's a marriage, she may be lying, etc., etc., the process will still continue to remain very, very tedious tedious, draining, exhausting, humiliating also for the woman who is coming forward with her complaint. So I am not sure if, just making, even currently the laws that we have in place for protection of women they have gaps, yes, but they are still very good. It's in practice that they are rarely implemented. Even, whatever relief that the courts, that legislation is offering, to reach to that also is a tremendous task. And, you have to fight your way through all the stakeholders involved. So it may make a difference, yes, but it will come in from training and, overall just small everyday changes of the judges, the public prosecutors, police, etc., and society at large. So, as per me, if socially, all of us move towards that, where the women's autonomy and her freedom, and especially in instances of sexual violence, that stigma of what she was wearing, where she was, who she was with, as you correctly said, in in the Jyoti Singh's case, which is called Nirbhaya. If she were alive, then, she would be put under scrutiny that, she was late at night in a bus with a man, or, who's not her husband, and, things like that. It's only because she didn't survive it is why there was so much, empathy, sympathy from all sectors of society.
I completely echo what Vasudha says, but I'll add one thing here, which is that my own feeling is that, even from what survivors want, right? I think per se, removing the marriage, I've said this 20 times already, so I'm not going to repeat that, that removing the marital rape exception is, and therefore making marital rape punishable under extant sexual assault laws, that is not necessarily going to increase reporting. Because like I said, most people do not want, most women and many children also do not want criminalization of people that they know. Especially because, and there have been a few good reporting on this in the last couple of months, that anyway bail leke insan bahar aata hai, people come out with bail, and then that also poses a threat to the survivor's own person, right? And to children, etc. So it's not, I would, and also, there are studies done by Anveshi like 20 years ago. Many people have written about this, why Dalit and Muslim women in particular do not report marital or domestic violence, even violence by their natal families or people they know. They don't report it because of the criminalization aspect. Because criminalizing it is not going to help them. I am repeating yet again, I think that that some kind of actual substantive help would be on the civil side, right? And many of those things I spoke about, right? Having witness protection, having long-term housing, having the right to disappear, as it were, protection orders, lots of other things would definitely help. And having state pay for or universal quality child care and education, etc. All of those things would help women a lot more to escape these relationships of sexual violence within which take place within social legal relationships, whether by a father or a grandfather or an uncle or a cousin or a nephew or a husband. Women want to get out of that. Criminalization is not particularly helping them. Yes, there are people, including Jyoti Singh Pandey's mother, who continue to, fight for the death penalty for rapists, etc. But they are still in a very tiny, visible minority of people who survive violence, especially sexual violence within family, within social legal relationships. So I think that the answer should be civil. I've always thought about it in the context of sexual harassment at workplace also, but also of in general sexual violence, that O.J. Simpson case you must be knowing about in America, right? So O.J. Simpson was not criminally prosecuted finally, as in the order did not hold the criminal charges against him, but the woman whom he murdered, whom he killed for all apparent purposes, her family sued the hell out of him. So I honestly think that if you're thinking in terms of material whatever, until the state can and law can provide, and society is ready to provide all of these other things to people who are exiting violent familial relationships or social legal relationships or sexual violence, until you're ready to provide all those things, then at least in the law provide some way that there can be huge, massive monetary compensation for the violence you've undergone. That can allow you to do all those things for yourself then. So for yourself and your dependents, including your children, etc. So I don't think criminalization that will result from removal of the marital rape exception will necessarily help women, and in many cases, many parts of society, it may make women not report sexual violence by husbands anymore, or in the context of DV and DV Act, as in cohabitants in the shared household. It may make them hesitant to then report sexual violence also, which is currently provided for in the domestic incidents report, and therefore in Form 2 when you file under DV Act. So they may hesitate to do that. See, as Asudha pointed out, right now you can say there is evidence of sexual violence or even sexual incompatibility, and you can contest and maybe even get a divorce more easily than you could 30 years ago or 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Does the divorce make more sense for the woman, or does it make more sense for her that the man will be put in jail for doing that sexual violence? The question is that. So for a survivor, it's not necessarily criminalization which helps for most survivors. Most survivors.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one more thing I wanted to add is, she brought up the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. That, you can see the stark reporting difference between that and just in general, other forms of sexual harassment, which are, so this, because it is done with, there's privacy maintained. Mostly, it's also taken over by corporates. It may not be done everywhere properly, but in places where it is, women come forward and report more easily. It's civil in nature, it's easier to report, and it's quicker, etc. What's the point of, even if for the women who seek, to have the person behind the bars and suffer, etc., if it's going to happen after 10-15 years, by then you already may have, made your peace with it, moved on with your life. So, and she rightly pointed it out, him being behind the bars will not, make her life better, apart from maybe some relief. Of course, I don't mean to undermine that, but it does not make any sort of material difference to the way she's been living. So, but yeah, we should also take into consideration how in civil side with sexual harassment, the process, by making it easier, etc., people are coming forward, and the survivors, it's easier for them as compared to going to the police, etc.
Thank you for the conversation, Taranga and Vasudha. I hope everybody listening to us today has been able to take something away from this. A complete list of sources and resources will be made available in the description section. So please be sure to check that out. And once again, Taranga, Vasudha, thank you for your time. And with that, we come to the end of this episode.